So I'm only going to spend one video in this entire series talking about what I think makes a good story and the sort of elements that you need to put into a story in order for it to be a good story. Even if you think you already know what those elements are, I do encourage you to stick around because near the end I will be giving a couple tips on how to further improve your inspired images to get your story ready for its first draft. This video is called The Theme of Redemption because your story can't all be depressing. There can be sadness, but the very ending needs to be good, victorious, and joyful. So you need to give a hopeful message in your story. That is that you need to actually show a society that builds virtue, what a virtuous society looks like. And you need to be able to have your character move from redemption and take virtue with him in order to move through his plot. So I have created 10 tenets of what makes a good story, and I can't go through all those tenets with you in this short video, but the first of those tenets is that a good story flows from a theme of redemption instead of a theme of despair. And I specifically use the word from and not to because I think it important that your main character flows from redemption, not necessarily one that leads to redemption at the end of the story. Some stories of today only lead the main characters to redemption at the very end of the tale, and because of that the story is filled with turmoil and just a whole lot of exhaustion before you finally get to virtue. Don't do that, but rather instead have your main character take virtue with him as he faces his plot. And then of course you can face several situations, and even side characters can be brought to a position of redemption through the story, but your main characters need to be able to understand what virtuous society is and take that into the story. You need to show society as a whole, and as such it's good to cultivate that virtuous society as a whole. Redemption means to buy back or give deliverance, and so that's why it's important to have your main characters delivered and able to bring deliverance into other characters and places of that story. You need to be able to sustain your reader on every page, and that doesn't mean to always keep the reader at the edge of his seat. If your reader's always at the edge of his seat, then he's much less likely to go back and reread the story once he knows the plot. But rather, you need to have those moments of suspense, but they need to be coupled with moments of sustenance, moments of refuge, peace, strength, where you can actually just zoom out and see what the main characters are doing on an everyday basis, and actually just get a feel for the sort of culture of your story. So now to progress your story, begin by constructing the overarching plot of your story. Ask yourself this question: what do you want from this story? Now, if you cannot just chronologically answer that question, then try to reverse engineer it in your mind. Use your inspired image to create your story ending. Think about how you want the story to end. And make sure to keep the imaginative feel of your inspired image. Next, think about the sequence of events that made or allowed your main characters to arrive at that ending and write those down, just in a very brief format, less than a single page worth of material. Lastly, create the beginning of your story. Where and how do you want to introduce these characters, places, storyline, and everything that then launches your story? So begin by writing on a piece of paper generally what it is you want from your story. This is how I start every story. I start out with a single piece of paper, and on it I write what I want from story, and I underline that heading, and then underneath that I spend just a few paragraphs describing what sort of story is this? Is it a Victorian story, Edwardian story? Is it an 18th century sailing ship story? Is it a medieval story? What sort of story is it? What elements do I have of the plot already figured out from my inspired image? What is my inspired image? Just that sort of general information. From your imagination, what is your story about? What brief plot have you formulated? Write this down. You have now created a very brief outline of your story.